via the live stream here, and welcome to anybody who's with us so far. I'm not quite sure why the webcam is running with such pixelation, but I presume it's adjusting itself to the speed. This is an amateur radio transmission, and we transmit historical spoken word material each week at this time. This is 9:29. It's about to tick over to 9:30. At that point, I switch on this and we go to air on 147.475 megahertz NBFM. Good evening, everyone. 9:29 still. I'm waiting for it to tick over to 9:30 so I can start the stream. There'll be quite a bit of historical material from wax cylinders this week, so I hope that's of interest. Okay, 9:30. Hello, this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima, VK3AML in East Burwood, and transmitting on 147.475 VK3AML. And those are actually the very early NBC chimes that were recorded off air in 1928 in New York. It's been a fairly full-on week for us here with various tests. I was very privileged to have the assistance of Tim, VK3FTZD, who provided me with a tablet computer, and we were able to go to various parks around Melbourne testing and transmitting digital slow scan television images. So now wherever I go on field days with the ham radio gear, I can transmit pictures of where we are and what we're doing, independent of internet. Doesn't matter where we are as long as we're within 2 meter transmission range. We also had help from Terry, VK3FTJS over in Hoppers Crossing, and Ian, VK3ST. And just last night but one, on Thursday night, we were operating from a local park at night with portable transmitting gear and the digital slow scan on the computer, along with the interface between the computer and the transmitter, so that there also we could transmit pictures. We've got quite a few historical recordings this week that have popped up out of the internet morass, and one of them relates to the start of talking pictures. The very first talking newsreel to be shown in Melbourne on the first night of the talkies, which in the case of Melbourne was at the Athenaeum and the Auditorium. The Auditorium showed the jazz singer in Collins Street, and further up Collins Street at the Athenaeum, they were showing a feature with music and sound effects, but no talk, supported by a talking picture program, a film called The Red Dance, February 1929. The newsreel that went with that first program at the Athenaeum was of King George V opening a bridge over the River Tyne. And I've never been able to find a decent newsreel of anything but the outtakes from the speeches given on that occasion. But just this week, I came across a disc, a Columbia disc, limited issue, given, I believe, as a souvenir to people who are actually at the opening of the bridge over the River Tyne. And so we can finally at least hear the soundtrack intact of King George V's first performance on a sound film. And it's this, the 3rd of October 1928, King George V. He said, clicking the wrong mouse.
The Queen and I thank you for your loyal and dutiful address and its words of cordial welcome. It is a great pleasure to us to visit Gateshead on the occasion of opening the new bridge, which so nobly spans the River Tyne and forms another great highway between the two counties. I am happy to recall the visit paid to the ancient town of Gateshead by my dear father when he opened the King Edward VII Bridge. The similar ceremony which we are today performing forges a fresh link in the chain associating my family with the Tyneside towns. I warmly congratulate you on joining with your neighbors to erect the new bridge. It is a worthy testimony to the energy and foresight which enabled the Tyneside towns to present. It is therefore all the more gratifying to know that much as your town has suffered, you have shown your enlightened public spirit in proceeding with this great civic enterprise. Those who have planned, designed, and executed this work may justly be proud of their labors. I pray that with God's blessing, more prosperous times may soon return, that your trade may reap the benefit of these improved communications.
To the King's most excellent Majesty.
That was King George V. Let me see, it would be the grandfather of the present Queen.
The County Borough of Gateshead beg most respectfully to express our gratitude and thanks that upon the occasion of the official opening of Tyne Bridge, your Majesties have graciously consented to visit Gateshead. We humbly offer to your Majesties a warm and beautiful welcome to our ancient town, with the assurance of our wholehearted and faithful allegiance to your Majesties and the throne. We, in common with all other loyal British subjects, gratefully realize how fully your Majesties, whether in time of prosperity or adversity, have ever manifested a gracious and ready interest and sympathy with your people. And our earnest prayer is that in the providence of Almighty God, health and strength with divine guidance may be granted to your Majesties to reign over the great British Empire for many years to come. Given under our corporate seal this 3rd day of October, 1928. W. Edwin Ward, Mayor. W. Swinburne, Town Clerk.
And that was W. Swinburne, the Town Clerk of Gateshead. The soundtrack only, unfortunately, of the earliest known newsreel of King George V, on the occasion of being filmed by the Fox Movietone newsreel. The Fox reel, now owned by an former Australian, much as I hate to say it, Mr. Murdoch. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the usual Saturday night miscellany of historical recordings, which I hope may fill a few hours profitably for the ham radio listeners particularly, and the people watching on internet stream. And I believe from the notices I'm getting that the stream is hiccuping a bit tonight. There must be some reason for it being loaded with considerable internet traffic. I believe that there's been, from what Terry Sims has been telling me, there's been a fairly large earthquake in central China, which may increase international traffic quite a bit in terms of news crews trying to get video into the country. Whereas this video stream is obviously fairly low priority. Going back to the 20s again, I find the history of the BBC, which is much better documented than our own ABC in terms of sound recordings, particularly fascinating, and how people approached broadcasting at a time when nobody had a concept of what broadcasting was about. It would be of interest to anybody. Certainly it was a period where considerable creativity was and could be exercised because of the small enthusiast nature of the initial listening audience in the early 1920s. One of the very first appointees to the infant BBC was an announcer and writer named Cecil Lewis, Cecil A. Lewis, who had been a World War I fighter pilot and was finding his feet in Civvy Street as a journalist, first of all for various magazines, and then under Mr. later Lord John Reith, doing quite a bit of scripting for the BBC. Now, when the BBC started, it was extremely formal. And most programs had to be scripted long before they went to air. The one exception, strangely enough, was the children's session. So naturally, most of the announcing staff wanted to get onto it so that they could make their own creative input. Here, Cecil Lewis, as an old man in 1978, recalls what it took to make a children's program for the BBC in 1923. And it gives quite an insight into how formal early broadcasting was and how much they were trying to prick the bubble of formality. Cecil Lewis.
It started in an absolutely impromptu way. I mean, after all, who had ever heard of a daily program to children? It was something quite new, and we'd no idea how to handle it. But, you know, it was fairly obvious that some light music would be all right. And it was equally obvious that if we could tell simple children's stories, it would be all right. And the only thing was to get people who were naturally sympathetic to children and had a feeling that they enjoyed doing it. And so, in fact, we all took part in this. Arthur Burroughs and myself and Stanton Jeffries, who was always at the piano improvising. He improvised the backgrounds to all the stories. And sometimes we made up stories, invented stories as we went along. And then we had a couple of aunts who came in, Aunt Sophie and Aunt Phyllis, who came in quite early on to give a woman's angle on it. I don't think actually our children's hour was very good. I think it was pretty amateurish, but it was full of unexpectednesses because nobody really knew from day to day. I mean, this was something we didn't work out beforehand. We went down and somebody got hold of a book of children's stories and would read one, or if we hadn't got one, we'd make it up. And then Jeff would do an improvisation on some children's theme or some children's rhyme or some simple tune. He would elaborate on that for a few minutes, and then we would have a bit of chatter between the aunts and uncles about this and that, and we'd read a bit of the children's letters that came in and answer questions and do all those sort of things. But the whole thing was very, very much a free-for-all. We just did what we could.
Why was there this auntie-uncle business?
I think it was an attempt to achieve a sort of relationship, a sort of intimacy on the microphone, and a good relationship between the uncles and aunts in the studio. So there was always a good deal of banter and joking between us all, and we were all very good friends, and we succeeded in establishing a sort of team of Uncle Jeff, Uncle Arthur, and I was Uncle Caractacus, you know, and that was a ridiculous name I gave myself. So people got hold of this, and it was, you know, an amusing thing. there was nothing. It was all very light-hearted and not at all premeditated or worked out in any way. It was a jolly sort of time, which we as very young, after all, we all in our 20s remember. We were such young people. People forget nowadays when that this whole venture was placed in the hands of kids. Really, that's one of the reasons why it went for such a swing. I think why it was so popular and so enthusiastic, and why it developed so quickly. I think it was only later that the middle-aged, the bureaucrats, and as we got older ourselves, of course, and I'd left it long before then, but people began to settle down and become serious and studied and all the other things that one shouldn't become.
But did the children themselves react to the program?
Yes. Oh, yes, rather. The children's mail went on at a very high level, higher than any other reaction or audience reaction. And, of course, we had streams of them up. We had all sorts of parents and children who'd won competitions, children who'd done well at school, children who'd done this and that, really any excuse to get them up and to allow them on the microphone to say something or other and to call them up on their birthdays and congratulate them on their being 6 or 7 or whatever it is, and their present was hidden under the piano or under the bed or something like that, Those sorts of things went on. And it was all very gay and very trouble-free, really. It was a pleasant, happy time, really, in the early broadcasting programs. And I think on the whole it was fairly clean and decent and well-mannered, and there was never anything that could do children any harm in it, shall we say. I mean, I think it was a good part of children's education to be subjected to that possibility of making friends with unknown people, like that. And it sort of gave them a larger interest.
Now, is it therefore true to say that this was the one area of programs in which people were allowed to talk at the microphone unscripted?
Absolutely, yes. You're quite right. This is the only place where we could talk as we wished, and nobody controlled it. And it did, and it was very interesting because it really didn't matter. You see, nobody really overstepped the mark or made 1 or 2 small mistakes. But I mean, nobody ever used bad language or nobody ever told dirty stories or anything like that. I mean, it was all absolutely, it all went absolutely all right. There was never any problem.
These are the London and Devonshire stations calling. We are now back again at the London studio, and we shall now proceed with the Children's Corner. Hello, kiddies. Hello. Uncle Norman calling. Now, we haven't got much time this afternoon, so we must push along with the birthdays. Many happy returns of the day to Billy Wilkins of Barking. You look in the dustbin at the bottom of the garden. Jimmy Muggins of Golders Green. You look in Granny's ear trumpet. Something nice in there, Jimmy. Happy's to Betty Gibbons of Chawton Come Hardy. You look in the news of the world. Something startling there, Betty. Donald McPherson of Aberdeen. You look in the loudspeaker at 7 o'clock, and Uncle will give you the time signal. Teddy Mathefkin of Penny Come Quick. You look in the gas meter. Lots of pennies in there, Teddy. That's all, kiddies. That's all for tonight. Good night. Sleep well. Good night, kiddies. Good night. These are the London and Devonshire stations calling. We are now back again in the London studio and are now going over to the Savoy Hotel for dance music until 12 o'clock. Savoy Orpheans have just played that delightfully dreamy tune, Sunlight and Soap Suds. The Savoy Orpheans will now play you another one of their big successes.
Oh my, that's good. I think that's awful. Thank you.
Come on, Sonny, it's too late. The time's just gone, sir. Have a lemonade, sir.
No, thank you.
No lemonade, sir. Nothing doing, sir. Very good, sir. All right, sir. That will conclude our transmission for tonight. The London, Daventry, and all other stations are now closing down until April the 1st at 6 a.m. Good night, everybody. Good night.
Cecil Lewis talking about the earliest days of the BBC, and then Norman Long introducing, no relation I might add, introducing the Children's Hour in December 1925. This is VK3AML testing, the usual Saturday night test, and also streaming over YouTube Live. If you dial in VK3AML 22 May 2021, you should be able to see us. That's VK3AML 22 May 2021. If you Google that, you should find the video stream. Cecil Lewis, who was interviewed there, of course, as I mentioned earlier on, had been a fighter pilot in the First World War. And being a good journalist as well, he's left us with one of the most vivid descriptions of what it was like to be a fighter pilot in that war. Flying biplanes that were held together with wire, canvas and spruce, and rarely had more than one machine gun or a very light bombing load. So let's hear Cecil Lewis talking about his time as a First World War pilot. This was one of many interviews that was recorded in preparation for a major BBC production effort in 1964 called The Great War. Some of you who are around my age might remember it running as a series on ABC television at the time, 1964-65. And Michael Redgrave was the narrator for the series. You can find The Great War BBC series on internet if you know where to look. But here's Cecil Lewis describing what it was like to be an airman in planes that were only 10 years removed from the invention of powered flight.
Well, you see, when I got to France, I only had 20 hours flying about. And when I was posted down to a 2C squadron on the Somme, the CO took one look at the logbook and said, "My God, it's murder, you know, sending you chaps out with nothing on the logbook. You better put in a bit of time." So they gave me an aircraft, and I walloped off, you know, to have a look around and see what the form was. And to have a look at the lines, to get used to the French maps, all the things that are different, you know, and the country were obviously a different country from the country of England that I'd been flying over a bit. And so it was that I really first had a look at the lines. You know, one had always heard behind the lines, this side of the lines, the lines, the lines, the lines, but I hadn't a clue as to what the thing looked like. And so one good, fine May afternoon, I got up to about 10,000 feet, well on this side, you know, to have a deco. The thing was quite fascinating because you realize that, I mean, what had happened was the battle had become crystallized and had to stop somewhere, and it, as it were, stopped in this particular point, and somebody had started to build a trench. And from that trench, people had begun to dig back communication trenches so they could get to it without being shot as they got into the trench, so to speak. And this whole system had been built up over months and months and months until really from the air it looked like, it really looked like more like, you know, one of those edges to a lace doily. You know, it's got a sort of fairly hard edge, and then there are all these little fillets running back in. When you put two of those together, side by side, not, of course, regularly, but moving as the contours of the ground, and that was really the effect. And, of course, the new digging in the earth showed up light, so that when you went over after experience and you knew what the digging in your particular sector was like, if there was any new digging, you could always see it because the earth was fresh and rather yellow. And all this went wheedling away right down from Thiepval up in the north, right round the Somme Fricourt salient, right round to the marshes of the Somme where our section ended. And it was just really like two pieces of lace put together in that way. And after that, and, you know, I'd put in a bit more time and got my logbook up to, I think, something like 30 hours or something ridiculous like that. The flight commander said, "We better have a go this afternoon. We want some photographs of the frontline trenches, so you take Sergeant so-and-so," I can't remember what the dear chap's name was, "and go and have a bang." So we got on board the 2C, and the 2C was totally unsuited to the job, of course. You know, it had the observer in front and the pilot behind, whereas within its sense it should have been the pilot in front and the observer behind, but it wasn't. So the observer sat in a sort of, he had four struts very close each side of him, and wires to brace him well in and in front, none behind, and a little seat which he could just get into. And he really could do nothing at all except keep a lookout, you see. And when it got to tall hot and you were liable to be attacked from the tail, not from anywhere else, He simply had to get up in his seat and kneel on the seat, you see, which was a jolly cold, drafty business at 8,000 feet, you know, even in the summer. So we set out on that afternoon, and the pilot, that was me, had to look after the camera as well, you see, because the camera was the only, in the pilot's seat, at least you could look straight down. So the camera was, you know, one of those real antiques made by them ancient Greeks, you know. It was absolute mahogany, good square mahogany box with a nice leather concertina pull out, I don't know what the technicians would call it, with a good big lens on the bottom and a nice polished mahogany surround to the box and a little handle that you pushed and pulled like this to change the plates. They were, you know, real good old glass plates. And in addition to that, a bit of wire or a bit of string, I can't remember, with a ring, a little curtain ring on it, which of course was skittering about in the wind, to pull every time you wanted to take a picture. That was the technique of the thing. The whole thing was strapped on the outside of the aeroplane, and it had a sort of ball sight at the back, ball and ring sight at the back. So to take the photo, you had to lean over the side of the cockpit and look down through this ball sight, which was just behind the camera, fly the aeroplane with the left hand, move the camera handle, changing the plates with the right, and every time you changed plate, you then pulled the string and waited until you turn along a bit more, and I thought, you know, had to judge the overlap and did it again on a box full of, I think it was 24 plates. So we were going fine. We had to do the second line trenches that just over about a few hundred yards behind the German front line, right round from Montabon to Pozières, right round the Fricourt salient and up the other side. And it was a beautiful afternoon, you know, not a cloud in the sky, and the whole thing looked absolutely peaceful. One didn't imagine there could be a war. There didn't seem to be anybody firing. The whole thing was asleep. It was really remarkable. This was the middle of the war, after all. 3 or 4 weeks before the Somme, no, 2 months before the Somme battle opened. So we got down in position and, you know, got the thing more or less trued up over the job and started to fly along. And everything went according to plan, and the sergeant was twizzled around in his seat looking excitedly over the tail to see if there was anything about it. And he had a Lewis gun, of course, on what we used to call a spigot mounting. He had a spigot this side and one spigot that side, and he could take the gun off and put it in the spigot that side or put it in the spigot that side, according as to whether he wanted to fire right or left. And he just had it there, and it was hanging there with the 50 rounds on it until such time as anybody attacked us. And so we went on for, I suppose, best part of 20 minutes, half an hour, taking these photos, and just about getting to the end when I saw 2 or 3 things just at the end of that patrol, which were amusing. The first thing I saw was a curious sort of, you know how it is out of the corner of your eye, when you're not really looking at something, you see it. Something moving like a lump. I really didn't know what the devil it was, you know, it was a mystifying sort of effect. And then I looked again and focused, and about 100 yards ahead, there was what was in fact the business part of a 9-inch howitzer shell right at the top of its trajectory, which was just about 8,000 feet, just about where we were, you see. It had come up like a lobbed tennis ball, you know, right up and down again, and right at the top it was going quite slowly, and it was a pretty hefty bit of metal, and it was doing this, it was turning in this sort of way, you know, before it gathered speed again, just on the top of the trajectory, and then it would go down. And this was such an extraordinary thing to see, because no one imagined somehow you'd ever see a shell, you know. However, there it was, and I was able, after having spotted it, and there were 2 or 3, the battery was evidently firing, and we saw 2 or 3 shells, and you could even, actually, when you once caught them, you could follow them right down to burst, but unless you caught them, you couldn't, you know. So that was the first thing, and that was all right, and then a little way off to the port side, after about a minute or 2 more, we were in between photographs. One was doing this and then looking around and making sure everything was all right, you know. There was a couple of puffs with like sort of dark mushrooms. Archie, as we used to call it. I can't think why it was called Archie. ACAC, anti-aircraft. And this was quite a usual thing, and at any distance of more than about 100 yards, it looked quite unreal, because although it was a bursting shell, you didn't hear anything over the noise of the engine, so these sort of things appeared like little puffballs in the sky for no particular reason, as far as I can see. You sort of twigged that they were after you. And when they got a bit nearer, when you could smell them, we used to say, you know, it's a bit tricky. But they didn't do us much harm that afternoon, and so having got the photographs, we just turned off and came home. By the time the Somme battle was about to build up, I'd been posted down into the middle of the Somme area to No. 3 Squadron, which was a squadron that flew an airplane called a Maran Saunier, French airplane. Looked like a cigar. as you can see. And this had at least the pilot flying in front and the observer behind, and it had the great advantage that everything underneath was clear. There was a plane above your head, which was the reason it was called a parasol, and you had a marvelous view down below. So it was ideal for dealing with contact with the infantry, which was our main job, reconnaissance and contact patrol. And on that airplane, I flew the whole of the Somme offensive. During the build-up period, of course, we were doing the old job, which was so terribly important, particularly before a big offensive of this kind, and that was the photography of the lines and to see what new digging had been done, how the effect of the bombardment was going, and so on. Meanwhile, of course, the batteries were being piled in, and night after night, as soon as it fell dark, the roads were roaring with the traffic going up and the guns going into position, and this enormous feeling of a build-up of a big offensive. We were 15 miles behind the lines, and the day was peaceful, deserted. There wasn't a thing on the road. Nothing might have happened. As soon as dusk came, it started, and it went right through the night. And our billets were right on the road, and the noise of this, really, one had a tremendous feeling of war and what it meant in those moments. When everything was in position and they began to build up towards the main bombardment, which lasted, I think, for about a week before the actual offensive took place, we used to go out and photograph. And these jobs were among the most terrifying that I ever did in the whole war, because by that time we were flying very much lower. We were flying down to 1,000 feet. And when you had to go right over the lines, you see you were midway between our guns firing and where the shells were falling. And during that period, the intensity of the bombardment was such that it was really like a sort of great broad swathe of dirty-looking cotton wool, laid over the ground, so close with the shell bursts and so continuous that it wasn't just a puff here and a puff there. It was a continuous band, And when you looked the other side, particularly in the evening when the light was falling dusk, and as I did many evening patrols, the whole of the sky, the whole of the ground beneath the darkening evening was just like a veil of sequins which were flashing and flashing and flashing, and each one was a gun, and one knew that these things were coming over all the time. And they had orders, we were told, the artillery, not to fire when an airplane was in their sights. They cut it pretty fine, because really one used to fly along the front on those patrols, and that lasted for 2 or 3 days. And the airplane was flung up, with the shell which had just gone underneath and missed you by 2 or 3 feet, or flung down when it had gone over the top. And this was continuous, so the machine was continually bucketed and jumping as if it was in a gale. But in fact, it was shells. You didn't see those; they were going much too fast. But this was really terrifying, and I remember particularly on, I think, 2 days before the attack opened, and we had to get some photographs because they were terribly badly needed. We were down to about 1,000 feet in murky weather with a cloud bank overhead, and this grey swathe on one side and these flashing, continual flashing. One had the sort of feeling, they're firing at us. It's us they want to get, And this
is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the regular Saturday night test transmission on 147.475, as well as streaming on internet. And I believe we've got streaming issues. We're down to one viewer for some strange reason. The thing that I've brought out that people on the stream will see is the device in front of me, which is called an Edison Fireside phonograph. It's from 1909. Quite a simple device. You play wax cylinders on it. They fit on the end of what's called a mandrel. That's the cylinder equivalent of a turntable, like that. And they have a replay head in this, which is in my hand. People that are on the stream can actually see it. And with this machine, he said, trying to get the replay head back into place, but not having, there we go, having a lot of success. We can access all sorts of recordings from the late 19th and early 20th century. Not all of them serious, but by the time this machine was made in 1909, Edison's company had become a multinational. He had recording studios in Berlin, in London, in Milan, and headquarters in New York, of course, and produced recordings from about 1893 commercially, first of all for amusement parlours, or what we'd now call jukebox parlours, but they would also make them in a small way for expensive electric phonographs that were being bought at that stage by the general public. Now, one of the earliest cylinders sold to the general public, which has actually survived, I have on the list here, Edward Clarence. This is typical of very early cylinder record material, recorded on a brown wax cylinder in 1893, just as the industry was starting. And the people who were prepared to perform on these records had to perform over and over and over again. At this early stage, there was no way of duplicating the records. Every record made was an original. So the only way to duplicate them was to have the singer standing in front of multiple recording horns, in front of machines, not unlike this one in front of me, which people on the stream can see. And the performer would be announced. There was not much space on the record to put a title, and they'd sound like this.
Edison Record 864, song entitled Down on the Farm. Selection sung by Mr. Edward Clarence. When a boy I used to dwell in a home I loved so well, far away on Montfort Boulevard and the bees, where the morning to the refine around the cabin porch it winds.
I will save you from that. That was a recording from 1893, and I think you've heard enough to know how bloody awful the things were. In the next decade, surprisingly, although it was a totally mechanical process with no electronic amplification involved at all, purely the power of the voice concentrated down a horn onto a little disc which would vibrate in sympathy with the voice and vibrate the recording stylus directly. They could capture a fair spectrum of the voice, and it got to the point where some people of real wit were brought in front of the recorder. One of them was a musical performer named Arthur Osmond, who was renowned for singing risque songs that were just on the edge of what was acceptable. Not many of his records have survived because they were so popular. They were played to death. These things are on wax, of course, and they're fairly soft and easy for the replay machine after only a couple of dozen replays to erase well and truly. But here's Arthur Osmond in 1907.
Was strolling on the sands one day at Brighton by the sea. An old chap full of gin by accident fell in. He called on me to save him and to bring him safe to land, and said, I will reward you, you shall have my daughter's hand. I said, all right, here goes. I unloosened all my clothes, and I took my coat and vest off, and I think I took the rest off, for I meant to jump in like an earnest grafter. I took one glance at his daughter, then I shouted from the water, not today, or tomorrow, or the day after. I used to be a sailor. I use better language now. But once while thieving slacks, we fell amongst some blacks. Our bosun was a big fat chap, weighed nearly 20 stone. And he and I were bunged into a dungeon on our own. His big fat form I viewed as lumps of shaggy chewed. Then Jack Shepherd, he was aping. He said, here goes for escaping. I shall crawl right through that crack that's in the rafter. I looked down at his stomach and said, what with that, Lord lummy, not today, or tomorrow, or the day after. I once worked in a factory where dynamite was made, and very strange to say, I used to smoke all day, until one time a red-hot spark fell in the magazine, and the gaffer who was standing near has never since been seen. The foreman then came back, and he said, you'll get the sack. And he seemed to get important, and he acted as he oughtn't, as he read the rules on smoking every chapter. I said, you can't attack me, because he won't be back to sack me, not today, or tomorrow, or the day after.
These records, as you may have noticed, mostly have announcements on them. This was a process that was current, accepted at the turn of the century. And in fact, Edison records have announcements on them up to about 1908, when they worked out how to print titles on the boxes in which these cylinder records were dispatched. And by this time, by this turn of the century period, the quality of what they could put on record was remarkably good. Edison had worked on oil damping of the recording head and could flatten the frequency response sufficiently to get a fairly flat response from 100 hertz to about 5K. And his recordings of particularly small string groups were really good. I'm just looking for one at the moment. Here we are.
Love Serenade, played by the Edison Venetian Trio. Her bright smile haunts me still, played by the Edison Venetian Trio. of The Mermaid by the Venetian Instrumental Trio, Edison Records.
Three Edison cylinders recorded in 1907, all by the Venetian Instrumental Trio, featuring a harp player named Charles Schutzer, who appears on many Edison cylinders of that period. All of those players were, just to put this in context, they were all deceased before 1920. So these recordings go back an awfully long way. What is it, 114 years at this stage? But Edison, as you can hear, had recorded a fair frequency response worth of material onto cylinder by this time. He had oil-damped recording heads, all derived from experiment, trial and error, not with any sort of acoustic measuring equipment, not at that stage anyway. And he marketed these machines that are sitting in front of me, which people watching the YouTube stream will be seeing. This is a fairly late machine. It's actually an Edison Fireside phonograph of 1909 vintage. Can play 2 or 4 minute records with a gear change mechanism out the end here. And of course, you could play back spoken word recordings on these as well as music. This is a test, by the way, from VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. As an explanation of the rationale here, I've worked with historical materials, audio and film, for most of my professional life since entering the workforce in 1974. So tonight I'm giving air, I suppose you could call it, to many of the recordings I've come across in that 45, 46-year period. The Edison cylinders preserve all sorts of material. The first poet to be recorded by Mr. Edison cylinders was none other than Robert Browning, who was recorded in 1888, only 6 months or so before he died, trying to remember the lines of his poem, The Road from A's to Gent, and getting befuddled. The record now is so worn that it's almost unintelligible, but I'll try and guide you through it as we play it. Robert Browning, husband of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who many of you will have heard of.
Robert Browning.
I sprang to the saddle, and Joris and he, I galloped. We galloped all three. And here he forgets his line. He tries again. And he's forgotten again. I'm terribly sorry, but I can't remember beyond that. And he signs it, as you can hear. And he gets cheered. Huzzah. That was a recording made by Edison's London agent, Colonel Charles Edward Gouraud. Unfortunately, not in great condition. Queen Victoria actually made recordings, at least two that we're aware of. In 1888, she was approached by the agent, not for Edison, but for his competing company, the Bell and Tainter Company. Alexander Graham Bell and his cousin Charles Sumner Tainter set up a laboratory in Washington, D.C., with the proceeds of the invention of the telephone, called the Volta Laboratory. And there they tried to develop a better method of recording than Edison and came up with a machine called the graphophone. Didn't have much success with it, but they did do a demonstration to Queen Victoria. And the cylinder of the demonstration has survived. You can't make out what she is saying, but you can make out the tones of her voice. And despite what people say, she didn't have a German accent. This is what is left of the Queen Victoria cylinder, followed by the earliest recording of a royal, the Queen's cousin, the Duke of Cambridge, recorded in 1888 also. So this is the voice, the only surviving recording, unfortunately almost unintelligible, of Queen Victoria. And there she was. That's all we've got.
I congratulate you on the marvelous success of this invention, which I think will produce singular results in the future.
And that was the Duke of Cambridge, a little bit more intelligible, congratulating Edison on the invention of the wax cylinder phonograph. This is VK3AML. Testing, the usual Saturday night test. And some other voices perhaps. Isaac Pitman, the inventor of the Pitman shorthand system, recorded in 1891. Also a little bit marginal in recorded quality, but I hope you can understand this. To try to publicise the invention of the phonograph and make it something that was commercially viable, Edison's London agent, Colonel George Gouraud, who was a Civil War veteran and actually a war hero, awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his work in the Union Army. Colonel George Gouraud, as it turns out, toured various places where he could get access to famous people, exhibiting the phonograph, and recording those famous people. So here is Isaac Pitman in 1891. I hope.
To the photographers here tonight, my Lord Albemarle, ladies and gentlemen, photographers all, I greet you right heartily, and would be present in person if I could leave my desk with a clear conscience. So that this
Euro and his assistants. And its special thanks are due from to this association for obtaining thus fine, invisible presents.
Isaac Pitman, the inventor of Pitman's shorthand, recorded in 1891. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima, with examples of recordings on wax cylinder and, of course, early disc. You're listening on 147.475 VHF NBFM. And if you care to look in on the internet stream, VK3, look for on Google search VK3AML 22 May 2021. You should find us. Another cylinder perhaps of some music just to show the way the frequency response had been flattened by Edison by 1907 to make music quite acceptable. In terms of collecting enough sound power to actuate a recording stylus directly without electrical amplification, it was necessary that the performers gather very closely around the recording funnel and the recording machine. So consequently, small groups of musicians, string players, trumpet players, whatever, would record better than full orchestras. Edison acknowledged that by recording quite a few small groups, and in the chamber music area, there's quite a bit surviving from the first decade of the 20th century, like this. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima testing, and running quite a few different examples of audio recorded on wax cylinder in the last decade of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th. We've heard a bit of Queen Victoria. At the other end of the social spectrum, there, of course, was Music Hall, which we'll hear a little bit from later on. But Alfred Lord Tennyson, the famous Victorian poet, actually was recorded. He was recorded at his home at Farringford on the Isle of Wight in the year 1890. And his most famous poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, written to celebrate a battle during the Crimean War, 1854, was what he chose to record on that occasion. So this is Alfred Lord Tennyson at the age of, I think, 81, recording one of the few poetry efforts that he did cut cylinder. I think there are about 6 cylinders of Tennyson surviving, of which this is probably the best. Recorded 1890. Alfred Lord Tennyson, recorded in the year 1890. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the usual Saturday night test with archival material of various types. To give your ears a rest, we'll move on to a later poet, a recording from 1936 of a BBC broadcast, and this is the only known broadcast by William Butler Yeats. William Butler Yeats, who will explain the writing of modern poetry.
All modern poetry up to the Great War. The centaurs and amazons of Sturge Moor, Tristram and Iseult, of Binion's noble poem. There were always some long poems. My Deirdre, my Cuchulainn, had been written about for centuries, and our public wished for nothing else. Here and there, some young revolutionist would boast that his eyes were on the present or the future, or even denounce all poetry, back to Dante. But we were content. We wrote as men had always written. Then established things were shaken by the Great War. All civilized men had believed in progress.
Playing back old amateur radio contacts from 10:30 p.m. was the explorer, Sir Ernest Shackleton. Not only did Shackleton record, but also several of his party who were involved with the first attempt on the South Pole in 1908 made records. Later on, Shackleton, in a company of about a dozen men, including the Australian Frank Hurley, attempted to lead an expedition in 1914, a trans-Antarctic expedition from one side of Antarctica to another. They got as far as the Ross Ice Shelf and were beset by ice. Their ship, the Endurance, was crushed, and the subsequent rescue mission done by Shackleton's men, Shackleton himself and 4 companions, to South Georgia Island, the whaling station, which was the closest available whaling station, 500 miles from where they were shipwrecked, is one of the great epics of modern exploration, 1914. Fortunately, several members of Shackleton's expedition survived long.
We go back more than 100 years to one of the most astonishing epic tales of bravery, and it's the story of Ernest Shackleton and the crew of the Endurance, marooned in the Antarctic. In December 1914, 28 men, led by the polar explorer Ernest Shackleton, set off in the ship the Endurance on an expedition to become the first to cross the Antarctic continent. But to reach the Antarctic, the ship first had to plough through fields of floating pack ice, which stretched for hundreds of miles.
For 29 days, we crashed, pushed, and wriggled the ship through the ice.
The ship's captain, Frank Worsley, kept a diary.
A series of northeast gales had packed the icebergs together, and this time, the Endurance could not break through.
By January 1915, a day's sail from the Antarctic, the Endurance had become trapped in a thick field of floating pack ice. Unable to free the ship too far from land, they had little choice but to wait for the ice to melt. For the next 9 months, they remained stuck fast, frozen in the ice, while the floating ice field slowly carried them more than 1,000 miles north. And when spring returned, there was no escape. Instead, the weight of the shifting ice began crushing the hull of the ship. In the 1950s and 60s, surviving members of the expedition spoke to the BBC.
What was your first indication that she was in trouble?
Well, the ice got her under the starboard quarter and lifted her bodily, as it were, and threw her forward, and then she listed very heavily to port, and the timbers began to crack and groan.
Did you hear the timbers going as the ice tightened?
Oh, you couldn't avoid it. It was there like heavy fireworks and blasting of guns.
How did you find Sir Ernest Shackleton at the time when the ice was closing in and he had to abandon ship?
Very cool and collected. He sent Frank Wild along forward to our quarters, who explained to us that it was a case of get out and to pack our bags with all necessary equipment we required. Clothing, blankets, extra socks, mittens, and to be prepared for any emergency.
The crew managed to get supplies and 3 small 20-foot lifeboats off the ship before the Endurance crumpled and went under, swallowed by the ice. They had no radio, there was no way to raise the alarm, no one knew where they were. They considered trying to make their way on sled over the pack ice to reach land, but that proved impossible. So for another 5 months, they camped out on big slabs of floating ice called ice floes, hoping the ice field would drift closer to land.
And eventually we got to a large floe where Shackleton decided to make a camp, which we called Patience Camp.
We spent most of the time in our sleeping bags. Our chief occupation, of course, was looking for seals and penguins for food.
You must have been running short of food by then.
Oh, yes. We had supplies for a month or two when we left the ship, but we used to kill seal and penguin as much as possible. But as we got further north, they got more scarce. Consequently, we had to rely on 1 or 2 of our huskies.
But you ate your huskies?
Oh, yes. Very tough.
Did you have to abandon camp often because the ice fields were breaking up under you?
Frequently. I remember on one occasion we were turned in and whoever was on watch raised the alarm as the ice began to crack under us. It cracked under the men's tent. There were 8 of us turned in there. One poor chap named of Holness, him, sleeping bag that is, dropped into the water.
Shackleton leant over, grabbed the man in his sleeping bag, and with one tremendous jerk, jerked him out of the water onto the floe beside him, and undoubtedly saved the man's life. But instead of thanking the boss for having saved his life, the first words that the man uttered were, "God darn it, I've lost me darn tobacco."
They had to find solid land somewhere. They took to the 3 small lifeboats and weaved their way through the maze of ice floes and icebergs, looking for a path out into open sea. After 6 days, they finally made it to Elephant Island, a bleak, uninhabited rock sticking out in the Antarctic Ocean.
You must have been getting pretty tired after all these months. Was there any bad temper, any frayed nerves?
No, I don't think so. Everybody seemed calm. And when they saw Elephant Island, which we were making for in the boats, everybody cheered, and we pulled as hard as we could to make our landing.
It was the first solid land they'd encountered in over a year. They made a hut out of tents and upturned lifeboats, but someone had to go for help, or they all would die. Shackleton, Frank Worsley, the ship's captain, and 4 others set off in one of the 20-foot lifeboats. Few gave them a chance of survival because they hoped to sail the tiny boat 800 miles, 1,300 kilometers across the Antarctic Ocean to reach the whaling station on South Georgia. By now it was April, autumn becoming winter in the Antarctic. They faced mountainous seas.
The southwesterly gale had its birthplace above the Antarctic continent, and its freezing breath lowered the temperature far towards zero. The sprays froze upon the boat. The boat tossed interminably on the big waves under grey, threatening skies. We ate our scanty meals, treated our frostbites, and hoped for the improved conditions that the morrow might bring.
But at times their tiny boat, covered in ice, was swamped by towering waves.
This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima testing. In around about 5 minutes, I'm going to open it up at 10:50 p.m, a little bit earlier than normal, for a chat on 147.475 if anybody's about on the ham radio side. Just mentioning again, we're streaming this if anybody wants to look in. If you Google VK3AML, 22 May 2021, you should find the video stream. That's VK3AML 22 May 2021. You should find the video stream. Back to the documentary on Shackleton with interviews with his contemporaries.
I shouted, "For God's sake, hold on, it's got us." Then came a moment of suspense that seemed drawn out into hours. White surged the foam of the breaking sea around us. We felt our boat lifted and flung forward like a cork in the breaking surf. We were in a seething chaos of tortured water, but somehow the boat lived through it, half full of water, sagging to the dead weight and shuddering under the blow. We bailed with the energy of men fighting for life, flinging the water over the sides with every receptacle that came to our hands, and after 10 minutes of uncertainty, we felt the boat renew her life beneath us.
Somehow, after 16 days at sea, Captain Frank Worsley had managed to navigate them to within sight of South Georgia. But as they approached, they were caught in a hurricane. The storm forced them to land on the uninhabited side of South Georgia. To reach the whaling station, they now had to cross a huge, uncharted mountain range. Weak and half-starved, just 3 set out: Shackleton, Worsley, and the sailor, Tom Crean.
I looked down a sheer precipice to a chaos of crumpled ice 1,500 feet below. There was no way down for us. The country to the east was a great snow upland, sloping upwards for a distance of 7 or 8 miles to a height of over 4,000 feet. To the north, it fell away steeply in glaciers into the bays, and to the south it was broken by huge outfalls from the inland ice sheet. Our path lay between the glaciers and the outfalls.
36 hours later, after climbing peaks and sliding down mountains, trudging past crevasses and through a freezing waterfall, they managed to reach the whaling station and raise the alarm. It was May 1916, some 18 months after they'd set off. But it would be 4 months more before a rescue mission could reach the 22 men stranded on Elephant Island, and they were running out of food.
How did you manage to exist in conditions like that?
Well, the hut was cramped and dark and dirty, and we were dark and dirty too. We hadn't been able to wash, shave, bath, or change our thoughts, all our dreams, all our conversations were about food. Marston had a penny cookery book from which he used to read one recipe per night. Then each man took it in turn to suggest improvements and alterations. When the last man had finished, we turned over in arms. At last he had rescued us. With him, his men always came first. He was the most unselfish man I have ever met. And we who served with him, I think, were all the better for having known him. And when he died, we lost the best friend we ever had.
That's it for this episode of the Witness History Podcast with me, Alex Last. We have hundreds more episodes for you to listen to in our archive, so do have a browse around or visit our website where we have specially curated collections. Just search online for BBC Witness History. That's all from me for now, so until the next time, thanks again for listening. Goodbye.
And you've been listening to VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the regular Saturday night test. Mostly spoken word material, nearly all of it relating to events before the First World War. Okay, let's open it up now for a chat on 147.475 if anybody's still around. This has been a bit of a deviation from the usual radio-related discussion. This has more been to do with sound recording history, and those of you who've been watching on the stream will have seen the Edison phonograph and a bit of the description of the way those cylinder records, which we heard earlier, were made. So now calling CQ, this is VK3AML, standing by for any calls. Just hang on a sec, I'll find myself a piece of paper and a pen, or in its lieu, a pencil. There we go. Have we got any listeners? VK3 Alpha Mike Lima, standing by for any calls.
And overwhelmingly good evening to you, Chris. This is VK3ZZ.
And hello to Ralph from distant Chelsea by the Bay. How are you, Ralph? I think I've not seen you since the Moorabbin Hamfest about 10 days ago. Did you buy anything at the Hamfest, and did it come up trumps for you? VK3ZZ, VK3AML.
What did I buy? I bought an Air Ministry voltmeter, a lovely bakelite 3000 volt indicator, which I've yet to put on my 2000 volt power supply, but it just looks so official. I'm almost loath to use it, but it is such a beautiful meter. And I bought also, it was only $30. In 1983, I bought, actually for work, a little 10 megahertz single channel Goodwill brand oscilloscope, and they were surprisingly good for the price. And a few months later for work, I bought a dual channel 15 megahertz trio scope, and I sold my Goodwill to Mr. Stewart for almost the same price that I'd purchased it for. Anyway, here was its little brother at the fest, which I picked up for $30, and about to put back together again. So I really only bought it for old time's sake. I really don't need it, but it was such a marvellous little scope, and it actually worked, and it was actually fit for purpose, and it was only $200 thereabouts in 1983. It was a marvellous little thing, and I always regretted having sold it, but I've made good, and got another one for $30, and it still sort of kind of works. So I just bought that for old time's sake, and it was a very good fest. I'll tell you my little.
Is anybody else there to break in? VK3AML?
Yeah, 3ACZ. Good evening, Chris.
Yeah, hello, Peter. I'll just reply to Ralph there. I hope you can. Can you hear Ralph, Peter?
No copy at all.
Oh, okay. You can't hear Ralph. Oh, well, you'll both be hearing yourselves on the YouTube stream eventually, I suppose. But Ralph was just giving us a rundown of what he'd purchased at the latest Moorabbin Hamfest. Wonderful turn up, good stuff available, but a absolutely crappy venue, if you don't mind me saying so. The lighting was so poor, I couldn't actually search the boxes that were sitting under the table that had the junk that I find so attractive because I couldn't see into them. I needed a torch. The parking was dreadful. Steve Langley and I went down there, and Steve had to park his car in beer, wines and spirits on the other side of the rail line about 500 metres away. So it was a long way to go, and it was a long way to haul the heavy equipment back. Ralph, you bought an Air Ministry Voltmeter.
I want to make with Ernest Shackleton. If you haven't yet read his book, The Voyage of the Endurance, I would most vehemently and violently urge you to do so. You can download it from archive.org now. But it's even better in dead tree format. I read his book, it was years and years and years ago, and I opened it up last thing at night before retiring for the night, and I was sitting in my outdoor shed, which is unheated, and this was sometime in July, and it was already about 5 degrees inside the shed. Anyway, I began reading Shackleton's account of being trapped on the ice and the harrowing account of the voyage across the southern Atlantic. Anyway, we get to about 4 a.m. and it's time. I have to sleep for a couple of hours because it's work again. And I realised something absolutely astonishing. It was the shed temperature had dropped to about 2 degrees, and there was heavy condensation as I breathed out. And I realised to my astonishment, I had just been sitting in my chair reading this book with only light clothes, and I didn't feel cold. Somehow, reading the account of what it was like to be literally entombed in ice, and having got through it, and what these men had to go through and survive, and they did survive, and it was only World War I which killed a lot of them, which was a bit of a tragic end, having gone through that, and only then being drafted in for active duty, and most, a lot of them, not most of them, but a lot of them did perish in World War I after that. I didn't feel cold. I thought, this isn't cold, these people put up with true cold, and the 2 degrees in a sheltered workshop shed was not cold, and at least for that night, I did not feel cold. It was like I felt I was not entitled to feel cold, if you can understand that. What do you think of that? VK3AML, VK3CC.
VK3ZZC, VK3AML. I can kind of understand it, but not feeling cold because you're reading the account of Shackleton, and I suppose feeling very well off to have anything above zero. Or it could have been that you were slowly getting into the grip of hypothermia. I have actually, on one occasion on a hike when I got very wet in a very cold part of the year in southwest Tasmania, was aware that hypothermia was coming on because I wasn't thinking straight. And you get to a point where it's a really pleasant feeling that you want to surrender to. You can feel yourself losing your grip, and it feels good to lose your grip. And at that point, you realise if you got any cogent thought, if I don't do something, I'm going to be in big trouble. And talking to Dave 3ASC, who's hiked through similar territory more recent times, he has felt the same way. On that basis, I think that probably dying of exposure or dying of hypothermia would actually be quite a pleasant way to go, having experienced it on more than one occasion now. That being said, I understand where you're coming from with an interest in Shackleton. I think personally he's a far more interesting person, multi-layered person than Scott was, who is a very hidebound military man. Certainly Shackleton, I think, had a better regard for the safety of his expeditioners than Scott did. And with Shackleton, the aim was not just to get to the pole, but to do a lot of scientific exploration as well. Incidentally, made a very good film on two occasions. Interestingly, Shackleton's 1908 expedition in the Nimrod, which were the subject of two subsequent recordings made by Shackleton, the only two surviving recordings of him, one a cylinder made in 1910 and the other a disc made at HMV in 1909. On that 1908 expedition, Dr. Marshall, who was along with them, shot the first film in the Antarctic. And nobody knows where there's a print of it. I've written around the world to try and locate that film. Everybody assumes that Herbert Ponting's film of the Scott expedition is the oldest surviving film of the Antarctic. Not so. There was the Shackleton expedition film, 1908, 2 years earlier by Dr. Marshall, and nobody kept a bloody copy. Can you believe that? It was shown widely, theatrically, which he lost his life through an angina attack off South Georgia. They buried him on South Georgia Island at a way that subantarctic scenery to actually be there. I know a few people who've done it. It costs a lot. You have to go from Ushuaia, the southernmost port in the world, on Tierra del Fuego, and it's about a week trip to get across to South Georgia, but there are several whaling stations there in ruins. And the church still survives at Gritvik, and I'm not quite sure whether there's anybody permanently living there, but certainly there's a constant stream of Antarctic cruise ships that call in at weekly intervals. I'll hand it round to Peter, VK3ACZ, hoping you're still there, Pete, after that very long explanation of what Ralph said to me, but I thought it was necessary to fill the gaps in so that you'd get an idea of what was going on. VK3ACZ and the group now, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML in the group from VK3ACZ. Yeah, good morning. Good morning. Oh my goodness. Good evening again. I went out to go and play portable and share and got the earth rod and hammered it into the ground and got the antenna ready. Oh, the radio. Oh, that's right. I didn't bring the radio. That's probably the first. I mean, I do need to check myself into the dementia ward. But other than that, sat up on a hill this afternoon and had a bit of fun with some troppo there. Got to Deniliquin via the Mount Macedon 2-metre repeater, 3RMM. A fella from Deniliquin came up just briefly. Earlier in the day, had a talk to 3DLO Ron down at Karamat via the Mount William repeater from home here in Baronia. So, there's been a bit of activity. Of course, we've got the high pressure zone over us at the moment. But anyway, that's enough of my stuff. I'll put it back to you. I'm sorry that I can't hear Double ZC, but thank you very much for filling me in about what's happening at the other end. And I pretty much concur with what you thought about the Moorabbin Hamfest. But as it's my first one, I don't feel like being too uncomplimentary. Back over to you, VK3AML on the group, VK3ACZ.
VK3ACZ, VK3AML. Well, in many ways, it was an excellent Hamfest. Excellent turn-up, excellent selection of materials, great stuff to buy. I only bought a few connectors myself, but significantly, I bought some very good socks. There was a chap selling socks there, VK3CH, and they're the broad-necked socks that are great for people my age who don't want to have elastic ring barking their legs as some of the more synthetic types do. Thanks for the compliments on all of that. But yeah, the venue was not great. Poor lighting, poor parking, and the food catering very poor. One of the main things that you need in addition to just socializing is food and a bit of drink, not necessarily alcoholic beverages, but just somewhere to sit down and eat so you can talk to people. And it's lunchtime there by the time that happens. And there was something that passed as a food stand 2 floors down, and then nothing until you crossed the Nepean Highway and became a sitting duck. And you had to walk a fair way down the Nepean Highway from there as well. So a couple of people who were stallholders there have told me that they will not be attending again unless the venue is changed. Anyway, I'm just wondering, Ralph, if you could hear Peter. Peter has got a fairly powerful setup, but he's in the Baronia area. Which may mean that the hill that I'm sitting on, Ralph, is probably barring him from you. VK3ACZ and group with a pause in case anybody else would like to break in. VK3AML. Sorry, VK3ZZC, VK3AML.
Oh, I can hear Peter. It's just breaking the mute here. I can actually hear Peter. 100% copy, and a very good evening to you via relay or by direct if a little of a milliwatt or two of what's leaking out happens to get your way. Yeah, oh well, look, I guess we can moan about the venue there at Moorabbin Town Hall, but it was nice to see Moorabbin Town Hall again. It was I watched it. I literally lived around the corner from Moorabbin Town Hall when I was a young whippersnapper, and watched it being built actually, and attended with my parents on the grand opening sometime in 19. And it was all very exciting, and you can still just get a sense in the front entrance and the stairwell of the 60s grandeur. It looked all so incredibly modern then, and the spaceship lighting. Those spaceship lights are actually capable of properly illuminating the hall. From memory, that is, they're actually capable of being very bright, but looking at how they're suspended and how they're up there in the sky, I would think maintenance on those things would be difficult and expensive, with the result that it looks like less than a third of the light luminaires are actually
serviceable or actually in a fit state. But yes, it was dark, and just as well, I didn't buy any cent value. VK3AML, this is VK3CC.
That I was very glad to see everybody there. Nigel Holmes, of course, and Dave 3ASC, Steve 3SL, all the usual suspects. I think I got a photograph of you outside the front of the place before we all departed. A lot of us went across the road, across the Nepean Highway, and about 500 yards down we found a pizza place where we could sit down and have a cup of coffee. But even that was coffee, tea, pie, sausage roll, Fanta, Coke, all the rest of it. And that's enough to get by on. Heaven knows it's not gourmet food, but we didn't even have that at that venue. But as you say, a lot of us backed off from buying a lot. Steve Langley got himself a Roden Schwartz frequency standard, which goes from, I think, DC to about 2 gigs, and it has an FM input on this, the modulator inside their frequency source. And I noticed that Dave bought 4 cavity resonators for 2 meters, which I was hoping to pounce on myself, because when you're operating crossband in-band from one end of 2 meters to another, it's really necessary to have cavity resonator in the feed line from input and output for your transmitter and your receiver to separate one from the other. It's a bit like running a repeater in band. It becomes difficult unless you've got a high Q tuned circuit somewhere. So I'll hand it back to Peter, VK3ACZ. Were you at the Hamfest, Peter? Or I don't recall seeing you there, so perhaps you had another call on your time that weekend at the other than Moorabbin. VK3ACZ and group, with a pause in case anybody would like to break in. VK3AML.
Yeah, nothing heard at this end. VK3AML on the group from VK3ACZ. Oh, definitely there. You got a photo of me standing beside 3 Yankee Echo, which was one of the 2 really big thrills, other than walking around listening to voices and being able to recognise them even before I got them to identify themselves officially, from what I've been hearing on radio. And of course, getting the one of the door prizes was a special thrill as well, only because I think about 7 call signs were pulled out of the box and no present, not present, your worship, hi, and that allowed me to go home with an ICOM bag and a few other little goodies. But no, I'm looking forward to the next Hamfest, and I've already got an invite to an after Hamfest party at Ballarat when that comes up later in the year, so I'm looking forward to that one. Anyway, one thing I wanted to relate to you, Chris, is a good experience I had this week. I got followed home by a Yaesu FT DX10. It truly followed me home, and what else could I do? Anyway, I've set it up. It's got a couple of annoying quirks, but some really good features, especially the noise cancelling, noise blanking. It's certainly a far better radio in that sense than my 991A. I still think the best of them is my portable radio, the 891. Those numbers mean nothing to you. My apologies for that. But anyway, all going good. And I was thinking last night while I was listening to Clint's broadcast, 3EKH with the Astronomical Society of Victoria, I was just thinking I need to twist your arm up your back to get
a core exciter unit for potential amplification. On that subject, if anybody's watching the stream, and there's only one looker in at this stage, I think most of the others have fallen away, through Jeff, VK3 VJS, I managed to get these rather nice tubes, the Philips YL1150, and one tube can do the legal limit on AM. They're a hefty valve. The filaments take, I think, 6.3 volts at 1.5 amps. So they require quite a bit of heat. But they're low impedance tubes so that they can achieve the full legal limit on a plate voltage of about 600 to 700, which is a lot lower. It's about a factor of 5 lower than standard carbon anode transmitting valves. So these, I've got 4 of them. There are another couple that are coming from another source. If I use 2 in a linear amplifier, I should be able to get the full legal limit and then some, or a convenient linear amplifier to follow the 100 watt ANAN. Building a linear amplifier is sufficiently chunky and agricultural in construction that I can handle building that. Surface mount would be beyond me. The ANAN is sufficiently complicated. It's something I would never attempt to make. So that's an essential, and really that's the only thing standing between me and HF. I've got an HF inverted L up, which would almost be passable as it is. Oh, I see Ian Foster's on the chat box there. Need to remember that the only reason that the Moorabbin Radio Club could reliably run a hamfest was to be COVID safe, and the old venue was definitely not. It was the Kingston Hall. The council set it up and not us, and the food venue was only to be supplied by the council. Oh, bloody hell. We were not allowed to run the usual barbecue. Oh, I see. So it wasn't the EMD, the Moorabbin Radio Club's decision at all. Many did not appreciate the old lift and access, but it was a lot better than not having another hamfest cancelled, courtesy of the Wuhan virus threats. And Tilly says, only us pirates watching gave up, listen to YouTube, have to move to audio on 2 meters. And I think 2 meters is a lot more reliable, Tilly, than the YouTube streaming. I'm trying to find another way of streaming because this YouTube streaming does have glitches and lost frames. The broken up streaming has seen most viewers off. Yes, I wish there was another system. I don't need the video, really. All I need is a good audio streaming system, and YouTube Live is proving to be not so good. So that's my problem tonight, a YouTube Live that really is jerking and jumping. Okay. So you've got the explanation of why the venue was inadequate on this occasion, but it sounds like MDRC will be back to their old venue once the COVID thing is wound back and the virus inoculations get circulated. I'll hand it back, hopefully he's still there, to our friend in sunny Bayside, Chelsea, VK3ZZC, Ralph, VK3AML, with a pause. How are the breakers?
Okay, a nice pause there. Alrighty, Chris, I'll bid you good night. It's time for me to turn in. Nice to talk to everyone. Cheers to Peter there, if you can or can't hear me. But yeah, that's the reality with the venue, isn't it? It's July Hamfest this year, so they've already said it's not. As I don't run a museum, stuff that's in here has to be useful, or I don't keep it. But there you go, oldest piece of equipment here. Bought. Well, it wasn't even bought at Rosebud. It was on a free to good home table. So it just goes to show. Anyway, good night to everyone. Nice to catch up with everyone again, and you'll hopefully hear from me again next week. VK3ZZC is now concluding. Good night.
Yeah, cheers, Ralph. We haven't heard anything from Ian Foster on the air, 3ST, but hello to him, and thanks for that information, Ian, on MDRC, Moorabbin. So obviously the MDRC people had their hands tied in the choice of venue. Only the Kingston Centre. Dear, oh dear, oh dear. Yeah, and talking to Jeff, VK3VJS, he certainly was a little bit upset by the whole situation there, and the way that the council didn't provide chairs from his point of view was a major negative. I was quite happy to walk around and look at various things. There are a couple of things there that I wish that I had bought now that I think back on it. For example, I know that Ian was on a stand where they had a 2-metre repeater system, and my knowledge of 2-metre repeaters is that I don't want to run a repeater here, but usually repeater transceivers are up near the legal limit, or capable of being up near the legal limit of power, and they can dissipate a bit of continuous power. So a situation like the transmission I'm having at the moment, where I actually have an FT7900 that's externally fan assisted to keep it cool. It's running 45 watts at the moment continuously, but it would be nice to do at least 2 or 3 times that power. I think 3 times is just over the legal limit. 2.5 would be okay. Okay, it sounds like we're winding up unless somebody...
In the diminishing group from VK3ACZ. Again, not to nag Chris, but one more thought about the 18-metre scenario. Last night on Clint's ASV broadcast, he had somebody text or message in to say that he'd been heard on an SDR on the California coast. I don't remember which one exactly. And I know I didn't last night, but some other nights I've scrolled around the SDRs and I've heard him coming in about a strength 5 into Hawaii. So I don't know, I hope last night, but some other nights I've scrolled around the SDRs and I've heard him coming in about a strength 5 into Hawaii. So I don't know, I hope that tickles your fancy a bit, or creates a bit of enthusiasm for getting out and putting the broadcast into even greater circulation than otherwise might be possible. Again, as I said, one of my motives is so that if the radio club are away on a playing radio weekend at all, we still get the benefit of your broadcast. But yeah, it was kind of strange at Stringy Bark Creek only a week or 2 ago. We had to drive about 7 kilometres to be able to make a phone call, because that was the only place we found any mobile phone coverage. So yeah, the opportunities for tuning into anything except HF were pretty limited, and will be wherever we go, because that seems to be the nature of where the club choose to hang out. And it's a good setup too. You know, they put G5 RVs as high as they can up in the trees, about 70 or 80 feet high. Jim had a special beam for 20 metres this time up in the trees. All good. Anyway, just waffling along. I'll hand it back to you, and if we're winding down, I might make this close to, well, one more over as the final. And thank you again for a great broadcast as always. VK3AML, VK3ACZ.
I keep waiting for somebody else to break in. Do we have anybody else who'd like to join us, VK3AML? I've often wondered if the fact that this is going out on internet discourages people from actually coming back to us on 2 meters. When I eventually get this going on HF, I'll have listening facilities on a remote web SDR so that anybody on 80 meters can talk back to us, possibly in-band, cross-band. Not quite in real time, but certainly with a few seconds delay. It's actually difficult to run crossbands with a web SDR because they do tend to delay their output by about 5 or 10 seconds, and to try and talk back and forth like a phone conversation with that sort of delay is a bit of a pain in the neck. Okay, it looks like it'll be a short one tonight. Ian hasn't taken the bait to come up, Ian Foster, 3ST. Pity, would have been nice to speak to you, Ian. But I'll hand it back to Ralph for a final VK3ZZC with a pause in case Ian or any other person would like to break in. VK3AML. Are you still with us, Ralph? Ralph's gone. Sounds like you're going too, Peter, so I might wrap it. Feeling a little bit tired too. I've had a week where I've been out 2 times this week doing digital slow scan TV in the field. The first occasion from the Kuchin Reserve adjacent to the police academy on Tuesday, and then again on Thursday, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. actually moderating the digital slow scan group from the local reserve, just to see if I could do it using a tablet computer. And the tablet was located in a skip dive by a friend of mine, Tim. He discovered that a certain government department was throwing out their Microsoft-based tablets and getting Apple-based tablets instead, and they literally threw the Microsoft-based tablets in the skip, which allowed us to clean out their interiors once they'd been recovered and set them up for basic duty, like generating digital slow scan, on which they work extremely well. They've got good internal sound cards and more than enough CPU power to operate digital slow scan TV. So it's a wonder it hasn't been done before. It's strange to see the chat text live and then you type it in after it's been up for a minute, says Tilly. Yeah, there is quite a bit of latency delay on this stream, which I think is one of the reasons that it jumps. It's very annoying with the dropped frames that appear in this stream. And if there was any other way without a licensing fee that I could get audio onto the net to be seen on the net worldwide away from these amateur transmissions, I would use it. But unfortunately, YouTube Live with my computer, perhaps my computer with a quad core and 2 gigs, is not fast enough. I don't know. Maybe it's my internet connection. Seems to be good for other things. Maybe it's the idea that my webcam is running 1080p and that's too much for the internet connection. I don't know. All I can say is that YouTube...
I'm just looking in my logbook here. On Friday, I had good contacts, W5IB in Eustis, Texas, a Canadian station in Prince Rupert, another one in Grants Pass, Oregon. Heard lots of signals. Admittedly, the grey line on 40 didn't last very long yesterday. Today, whole different picture. Struggled to hear any signals at all. It was very patchy, and you just never know what you're going to get. And it must make a grown man want to tear his hair out, those of us that have got any left. But there you go. So now I sympathise with the people having trouble with the YouTube stream. I gave up on it a few weeks ago. I haven't got regular internet access in the shed. I have to carry my mobile phone out. So there are just times like earlier on in the broadcast when you said, those who can see the picture. Well, and that was the moment where I wished I'd been watching it live on screen. But anyway, it's when I was watching, it was varying anything from 3 seconds to 12 seconds, and it seemed to stretch out during the broadcast without me being aware of the time dilation effect. So there you go. I'm sure Albert Einstein could explain something about that. Yeah, time and space are shaped by matter, and gravity is curved space-time. Hi. But anyway, yeah, another very enjoyable night there, Chris. I really appreciate the fact that you have a call back afterwards. It's always good to have that chat, and looking forward to the first meeting of the radio club in the new digs on the 7th of June. Trust that you've got that well and truly hammered into your diary there.
With bells on. I think July you have me down for, that's the earliest possible that you have me down for a talk on Deal Island and the expedition we did there in January. January, gee, it's moving away now. I really have to pull out the digit and get the rest of the videos all edited. Thank you to all the people on the text that have come up. Ian Foster, Tilly, John Young, Terry Sims, Paul Taylor, all very much appreciated. And no doubt if you're not seeing this direct, you can see it on the recording, which is left after I close the stream each week. I might add, I can't keep all streams. There are one or two where I've run into unexpected copyright problems with the last things that you'd expect to have copyright with. The recording of Conan Doyle from 1930. Someone had copyrighted it. I had no way of predicting that could happen at all. I didn't think it could. But YouTube insisted on silencing the complete upload. So consequently, there was no reason for keeping the video if the audio wasn't with it. So that was cancelled. That was about 3 weeks ago. And good night to Dennis, the avid YouTube watcher, VK1.